We're really excited to have Rob here in the office today. Rob has written the weekly Consumed column for the New York Times Magazine since 2004. Prior to that, he created and wrote the popular Ad Report column for Slate.com and has contributed to a wide variety of publications on the subjects of marketing, design, consumer behavior, and consumer culture. He writes on these topics and more at his own site, Mercating.com. His book that he'll be talking about today, Buying In, The Secret Dialogue Between What We Buy and Who We Are, was published earlier this month and has been called, quote, fascinating, a compelling blend of cultural anthropology and business journalism by Time Magazine. Additionally, Michael Pollan, author of In Defense of Food, calls Walker, quote, the most trenchant psychoanalyst of our consumer selves. Buying In is a fresh and fascinating exploration of the places where material culture and intensity intersect. So as you can imagine, we're really excited to have him here today. Currently, he lives in Savannah, Georgia with his wife and photographer, Ellen Susan, and their dog, the king of all dogs. That's his name in Spanish, but that's the translation. So please join me in welcoming Rob Walker.
Thank you all for shirking your duties and being here instead today. So we'll be pretty informal about this, I suppose. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, and I'm going to read a little bit from it, not too much, but a little bit, and then I'll try to draw up some quick conclusions that might be of interest to this audience, I hope, and then I'm more than happy to take questions or, open it up in any way that you guys want to. I don't do this every time, but I'm going to do it this time. I have a small favor to ask. And it takes a second to explain. There's a photographer named Tim Davis, whose work my wife introduced me to a while ago. And his website, davistim.com, where he has a really great series called My Audience, where he always takes a picture of his audience before he speaks. And I really loved the idea, and I thought that would be a great thing for me to steal somehow. But I had to, so it wouldn't look like such a blatant theft, come up with something slightly different to do. And also, I wanted to not have to worry about release forms if I ever decided to put something on marketing about this. So my little favor to ask is if each of you could just briefly obscure your face.
So wait, you have an audience and no one knows who they are?
Yeah, and holding up the book is a great, I don't have anything that's done that, but I do need everyone, okay, there you go, all right. You're going to be in the picture for your face, and there you go, thank you very much. You might be visible, but I'm not going to, I told you to cover your face. All right, so thank you for indulging me in that. Let me just say, sorry about all the coffee drinking. It's been a long week. Let me just say, so the book is called Buying In, and the secret dialogue between what we buy and who we are. People often ask about the subtitle. So just really quickly, since I worded it so well here, I'll just go ahead and read this directly to you. Like, what does that mean, secret dialogue? What am I talking about? I use the word dialogue because what I'm talking about in this book is not a one-way process. It's not simply about the intrinsic elements of, say, Red Bull or Google or whatever. It's not just about what a product is made of or what it's supposed to do, nor is it just about a brand image that's invented by experts and foisted on the masses who swallow it whole. Any product or brand that catches on in the marketplace does so because of us, because enough of us decided it had value or meaning and chose to participate, because of the dialogue between consumer and consumed. And I use the word secret because the way that dialogue plays out is anything but explicit. It's complex, it's subtle, sometimes misleading, and I suggest that it's changing, because over the years that I've been writing about this stuff, I think that secret dialogue has gotten murkier than ever. So what's changing out there is kind of the big question, or the big sort of, why bother to write a book like this? I've been writing about this stuff in one form or another since about 2000, which is a long time. And even back then, it was pretty obvious that there was something going on with the change in this kind of relationship between us and what we buy, and how and the media, and how we learn about things, and how we make decisions about them. technology is the big obvious thing that people point to as being sort of in the background, but so what change is that really causing? You know, when I started writing, I was functioning essentially, as you mentioned the ad report card, I was functioning essentially as a critic, and it was only over time that I started to do the more reported stuff where I was really talking to the experts and talking to marketers and talking to designers and trying to get behind the scenes of different product stories. And there was, you know, there were some prominent theories that I'm sure you're familiar with as to what's new in the 21st century consumer. And I have to read this because I'm quoting from something here. The dimensions of the latest trends in consumer behavior were outlined in an overview in the Harvard Business Review, a local publication. This new zeitgeist, the august publication explained, is being fueled by the efforts of consumers themselves, who have lately, quote, become articulate. One of the defining features of this fresh paradigm is the consumers' quote, demand for information. They are banding together, becoming better educated and better organized, with a growing familiarity with the tactics and with the mechanics of advertising. They've suffered from deceptive and stupid advertising long enough, that's in quotes. And it is only inevitable that power should shift to them in an economy that's moved from scarcity to abundance. These changes, the article summarized, have tended to make consumers more critical and to enhance their importance. And this was the state of things in 1939. That's when that article was written. So this idea that you hear a lot that what's new, the new consumer, is this new sort of super educated, super savvy, brand proof, above it all consumer, it's not a new idea. If you look back through the history, as long as there's been advertising, basically, there's been consumer resistance to advertising, consumer skepticism about advertising, and advertising experts complaining about consumers and offering up tips like listening to consumers is important in the new consumer. That's something that gets repeated over and over, and I list some other examples in the book. Familiar stuff of, you know, you can't fake authenticity and stuff like that. But my favorite thing is Advertising Age in 1940, talking about this new consumer then. That is the major problem facing business, and particularly advertising in the decade to come. And that to most advertising and merchandising men, this new consumer was, quote, an incomprehensible ogre. Which is not language that you're likely to hear in Ad Age now, but the sentiment, I think, is something that you're likely to hear in Ad Age or anywhere else quite a bit. So I don't think that that's what's new, and in fact, I think that the pervasiveness of that point of view now is a big reason that I wrote the book, because I think that there's some other stuff going on that's more interesting and that's more useful to talk about and to try to understand at least. The way that I tend to frame things is I think that there are kind of 4.5 rational factors for making a purchase decision. My 4.5 factors are price, quality, convenience, pleasure, and then the half factor, which is consumer ethics, which I'll come back to at the end and talk about. And that sounds like a pretty good rational framework for making any consumer decision. The problem with that framework could be illustrated by, a while ago there was a thing in Consumer Reports about kitchen stoves, and they ranked all the kitchen stoves, and there were 53 different choices, and all 53 were rated either good, very good, or excellent. So that makes it kind of hard to make a decision based on those rational factors when there's really not much difference between the 53 choices. It's hard for consumers, and it's hard for the maker of the stoves. How are they going to stand out? Like, how do you break through that and become the one that people choose? How do you become the Viking, for example? Familiar with the Viking range, right? One way that gets resolved is through branding. And I think this group probably gets this, but sometimes when I talk about branding, people think I just mean a logo or an ad or a slogan. And obviously branding is a bigger thing than that. My summary of it is basically that branding is the process of attaching an idea to a thing. And that can be done in a number of ways. You can even have a memorable phrase in your prospectus for your initial public offering that resonates with people and attaches an idea to your company, as an example. But it used to be, 100 years ago, that the ideas attached to things were pretty straightforward. It was quality, reliability, trustworthy. Pillsbury flour is more reliable than the unmarked bin of flour at your local market. Over time, those ideas have become more and more elaborate, and one that I often cite is the Dove campaign for real beauty, which is, making a statement, an idea about the nature of beauty itself, which is a huge topic for a brand to try to align itself with, particularly when what you're selling is, lotions and facial cream or something like that. But as we've seen, this can work, and there's really, despite the talk about, our resistance to branding and hating advertising, there's been a big cultural conversation started by the Dove campaign for real beauty. And I don't mean to suggest that as a result of that, anybody wakes up in the morning and says, yeah, I really like what Dove has to say about beauty. I'm going to go to the store and buy some Dove products right now. It doesn't work that way. But it kind of makes the brand salient to you. Maybe when you're at the store, you see it, it's one of the choices, and it kind of comes to mind as something you're familiar with or have a good feeling about. Yes?
If you don't mind us making a comment. When you were talking about the stoves, part of it is you go in and say they're all good, but what fits in with the brands I already have? So if I have all other KitchenAid, I have to get another KitchenAid. So it's also fitting into the big picture because you have this concept of, the rest of my house is outfitted with this type of brand or this standard of brand.
Well, in the case of something like the Viking stove, it's an interesting case because if you're curious, the Viking range didn't actually fare that well in the Consumer Reports rundown. It sort of came out in the middle. The incredible success of Viking has been explained in a number of ways. Restaurant quality stuff, obviously there's a quality issue there, although it may not be, if Consumer Reports is right, it may not actually be the top quality for the money. Even among the high-end stoves, it didn't come out on top. An interesting theory, and I'm sure that you're right, that there's a consistency issue in some cases, and that maybe would boil down to trust in a particular brand. But with Viking, when it was coming into homes, it was a new thing, and I've seen it explained a number of ways. One of the more interesting theories is that that what that brand stands for is this kind of, demand for the sort of creative expression almost through I'll be a cook and I'll cook really nice things, and I need the restaurant quality stove to do it, which is an interesting theory. Although it turns out that a shockingly high percentage of Viking ranges installed in people's homes are actually never cooked on. So something else is going on there that transcends those rational factors that I was talking about. And
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I actually think that consistency is itself a value, and not just because you've learned to.
The what is?
That consistency, that you mentioned, is itself a value that you look for. Even if you might even take consistency over quality, especially in a kitchen, which it's not like you can go and change your stove every couple of months if you want to. It's kind of a big deal to put it in the stove, and if you have, I did a kitchen a few years ago. If you have kind of a lot, the same brand appliances, they do have kind of a consistent look, even if one of the picks that you made is not necessarily the best one. Just having that consistency is itself something that's valued.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not as important as the other 4.5 things that you mentioned, but consistency itself, I think, is something that people do latch onto, especially in things that are hard to change, that are kind of permanent, like semi-permanent, like kitchens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that distracts from your point too much, but
I don't either. And I don't, the 4.5 factors, it's a framework to go in, and I don't mean to suggest that, I get a little pushback, I guess, sometimes, and maybe that's what's happening now, on the idea that if you suggest that people are guided by something other than pure rationality, people don't like to hear that. And I'm certainly not saying, as I was trying to make the point with the Dove thing earlier, that We are just completely guided by ridiculous decisions, and certainly if the Viking stoves didn't work, or if they exploded, or something like that, it would fail in the marketplace. There's no question. But the point about the 53 stoves is you can find that consistency in every single one of those products. And that exists in almost every category in the economy now. There's a lot of good stuff out there. It may not all be great, but there's a lot of stuff that's pretty good. So as a consumer, the challenge is, how do I figure out which one is right? As a business, the challenge is, how do I stand out? Sometimes the answer to how you stand out, no doubt, is innovation and just, towering over everyone else. When there are 53 competitors, that's hard to do. And even if you are the one of those 53 that really stands out, the other 52 are not going to be able to follow that strategy, but they're also not going to roll over and die. They're going to try to find other ways to connect with consumers. It's a little, I know it feels sort of counterintuitive to people sometimes to say, like, wow, there's a lot of great stuff being made right now. Like, it's really good, a lot of really high quality. But it's just a fact. There's more good things being made now than ever in the history of the world. And it's part of what makes the job of a product maker or a brand builder challenging. And it's why brands are partly more important. And so I'm going to read a passage here, if that's okay. It won't last too long. But I use it to talk about, it gets at the things that I think are changing and sort of the point of the book in sort of a quick, encapsulated way. And this is a section that people seem to like. So here goes. At Alberta Park in northeast Portland, Oregon, about 100 serious bicyclists, most of them young men, many tattooed and pierced, and at least one wearing striped tights and a floral thrift shop dress, arrived en masse on a Saturday evening. They gathered near a fenced-off hardtop court, and in teams of 3 began a bike polo tournament. Almost all were messengers, bike messengers, about a third of them local, and the rest came from Seattle and San Francisco and elsewhere, and they certainly lived up to the image of couriers as marginal, testosterone-charged troublemakers. They drank beer and they smoked cigarettes, among other things, and yelled profane insults at one another. These rowdy bike messengers, slugging their beer from 40-ounce bottles and smashing into one another in their bike polo matches, did not seem the sorts to play any kind of role in the creation of brand meaning. They seemed like a variation on the outlaw archetype, willful outsiders, indifferent to rules and norms. They were authentic and alive and as far removed from the rigid world of commercial persuasion as it is possible to be. They seemed not just indifferent to the culture of branded materialism, but hostile to it. But what appeared to be a slightly unlawful party in the park was in fact a part of the West Side Invite, prizes for which were underwritten by a $1,750 contribution from the Pabst Brewing Company. Curiously, there were no banners or signs announcing the beer makers' role in their fun, and no one from Pabst was on site to glad hand the bikers. PBR, as fans call it, was in the midst of a highly unlikely comeback. And the unruly bike messenger subculture had something to do with that. And this, from about 1975 to about 2001, PBR sales had year-over-year declined every single year, and had fallen in that time 90% from their peak in 1975 when it was actually a mass brand. Then in 2002, sales rose 5.3%. The momentum picked up the following year and continues actually today. The growth started and was most pronounced in Portland, a city that's best known in the cosmology of beer as a haven for fancy craft offerings. There, the lowbrow brew had risen to the number 5 ranked beer in town and the fastest growing of the top 50 domestic beer brands in the city. At first, even the people at Pabst, which had barely advertised for more than 20 years, were at a loss. The job of figuring out what was going on fell to Neil Stewart, a baby-faced 27-year-old when he joined Pabst as a divisional marketing manager in the summer of 2000, when most of Pabst's marketing efforts involved things like low-grade car racing sponsorships and fishing promotions was one of the things that he mentioned. But this sales rep in Portland had noticed that what he called these alternative people were starting to get into the brand. So Stewart went to Portland to visit the bars where PBR was selling. He dropped in at the Lutz Tavern near Reed College, where slumming students used to drink Blitz, which was a low-priced beer that had gone out of business, local beer, in 1999. And that year, the owner of the Lutz Tavern decided to start selling cans of Pabst for $1 as a summer special. Years later, the sale wasn't over, and PBR was the bar's top seller. Stewart then braved the Ash Street Saloon, a bike messenger hangout downtown. Found a similar story there. The bike messengers had favored Blitz and switched to PBR. But what was interesting was how popular he was. Stewart had been at Anheuser-Busch before, and he knew the process of going into bars as the local rep and trying to give people keychains and this kind of thing, which he didn't have to do with PBR. He would just go into the bar and sit down and tell the bartender he was the PBR guy, and people would just start coming over to him and wanting a t-shirt and wanting a keychain and wanting some stuff. And wanting, it turned out, sponsorship deals. But the interesting thing about this was that the common theme among all those who were embracing the brand seemed to be that they were young, smart, skeptical types, the kinds of people who can't be fooled by marketing and in fact tend to detest it. The beer industry spends about $1 billion a year on image making, basically, which is not surprising because it's been found that even hardcore people who self-identify as hardcore fans of Budweiser or Miller Genuine Draft actually can't tell them apart in taste tests. So a lot of money goes into making images. PBR, by contrast, had no image at this point. It hadn't been advertising for it in 20 years. So what Stewart concluded, his codification of the new meaning of PBR revolved around, of all things, the book No Logo, published by journalist and commentator Naomi Klein in 2000, and presented an argument about branding and marketing overload and the bullying tactics of this trend and evidence of a grassroots backlash against it, especially among young people. Naomi Klein's view was that this would feed a new wave of activists who targeted corporations. Neil Stewart, the Pabst guy, his view was that the book contained many good marketing ideas. He said it really articulated the feelings of the consumer that people are getting sick of all this stuff, all this marketing, and saying enough is enough. So instead of the traditional response to discovering that alternative people were embracing the brand, which would have been, say, taking out radio ads on the alternative station, they decided not to do that. And instead they decided not to do any, they even passed on chances to do things like back a snowboarding event or sponsor an extreme athlete. They planned no advertising at all. So what did that leave? Well, it left things like cash payments to rowdy bike messengers who want to screw around in the park, but who don't want to deal with banners or company reps getting in the way. And it was striking how many of PBR's many relationships were initiated by representatives of some subculture approaching Pabst. Stewart didn't court the bike messengers of Portland. They approached him. Later, he started hearing from messenger groups in New York and elsewhere. Other sponsorship requests were relayed to him through contacts at underground-ish magazines. Each little sponsorship effort, a skateboard movie screening, an art gallery show, an independent publisher, expanded the network. Now, a year or so after Neil Stewart took his trip to Portland, I went to Portland. And I was met there by Scott Proctor, who worked for the company. He had joined a few months earlier as the Oregon sales manager. He was a veteran beer guy, and he recalled bars accounts. Let's go visit this account. He remembered Pabst. He'd been in town a long time. He remembered Pabst as having had this minute base. In 1999, the company had 41 accounts, bar accounts, in the entire city. 5 years later, it was more than 10 times that. He was an affable guy, but he was openly baffled by what he called the weird PBR base. I've seen some different accounts than I would normally see if I was going to have a beverage myself, he told me. I've had to open my mind a little bit. So, now just before my visit, a Portland alternative paper, Willamette Week? Who's from that area? Willamette? Willamette Week? I get it wrong every time, so I have to. Willamette Week had run a big picture of a guy drinking PBR at the Lutz Tavern with a blurb that mocked middle-class, college-educated, salaried Portland hipsters for drinking PBR. It's totally not indie rock, so there, the caption said. So was there a backlash underway? Well, we visited the Lutz Tavern, which was a homey place with a pool table and an apple green linoleum bar top. Planet Claire played on the jukebox. The bartender and a few post-college age patrons, all of them young women, drinking cans of PBR, mulled the state of the brand for my benefit. They promptly brought up the no advertising thing. And while the subject of posers treating the beer as a fashion accessory came up, it didn't seem like much of a problem. Later, without Proctor, I went to Alberta Park to check out the bike polo shenanigans. Ryan Kelly, a mild-mannered messenger who was actually the guy who arranged the first PBR sponsorship, allowed that the beer's newfound popularity was slightly annoying, but basically he said we're going to drink whatever beer costs $1. Eventually I ended up at the dank and scruffy Ash Street Saloon, where I met a 28-year-old named Phil Barnes, who'd recently gone through 4 tattoo sessions to get a Pabst logo about a foot square burned into his back, which he showed me. Pabst is part of my subculture, he said emphatically. It's the only beer I think about. He was a skateboarder, worked as a cook, and described his peer group as, quote, scumbag punk rockers. Quote. Barnes was a little cagey about talking to me at first. His friends had worried that somehow a picture of his tattoo would get used to promote Pabst and he wouldn't get compensated. Later, however, he noted that he had never seen a Pabst ad of any sort, which he liked because it showed that, quote, they're not insulting you, quote. Barnes had seen that, I'm going to say it wrong again, Willamette. Can't get it. At Willamette Week item making fun of PBR drinkers, and he'd given it a lot of thought. He had concluded that he did not care. The only thing that's going to stop me from drinking Pabst is when I die, he said, lighting a cigarette. Okay. So, that little story, I read in part because that's a kind of bit of the flavor of the book in the sense of when I do these talks, I'm always just sort of going on and on about my grand theories, but the book isn't laid out that way. I'm a reporter and I spend time out in the world talking to people and doing stuff and seeing things firsthand. I'm not a guy just sort of sitting back and making it all up. I only make up some of it. But it gets at my bigger point in a couple of ways, which is what I think has happened of significance in recent years, on 2 levels. One is that to me, the upshot result of TiVo and the various technologies that have given us more control is that whatever empowerment they've given to consumers, they've also, in a funny way, empowered advertisers. And here's what I mean by that. TiVo is an easy way to see it. TiVo came along and it was sort of announced, this thing's going to let you zap through 30-second ads. And a lot of prognostication about, wow, that's the end of the advertising business, that's the end of network television, this is a huge power shift, those guys are on the run. Well, the thing is that the advertising and marketing industry is full of very smart and clever people, and their reaction to the arrival of TiVo on the scene was not going to be to call up their clients and say, you know what, it's all over. Things are going to be different now, and there's nothing we can do for you, so we can't take your money. They're not going to do that. They're going to say, well, how else could we get the message out? This little thing of something where you're doing these micro sponsorships of people playing around in the park is an example of the kind of stuff that has taken off. And PBR was doing it in part because they didn't have that much money. But there are plenty of other companies that I do talk about in the book, and I won't go into all of this, but that are major brands that have a lot of money and that have adopted what we all know now is called the media agnostic approach, or media neutral or whatever, which means any medium that you can come up with. From Axe is one that I talk about in the book. It's obviously a huge brand, a Unilever brand that was introduced to the United States during this period that I'm roughly dealing with, and has been incredibly creative. And they do some traditional marketing, but they've also built web games that have become popular, and you forward them to your friends. They've, I don't know if any of you, it would be interesting if someone has ever seen the, I think they're called the Bomb Chickawa Girls. It's sort of an AirSats girl group that they created and made a video for and put it on YouTube, 2.5 million views and counting, just to sit through what is in essence a long form ad for Axe products. Another interesting example is that they, in the course of their creative briefing, came up with this concept of the game killer. When you're familiar with Axe, it's like the sort of, macho for kids, young men, whatever the thing is. And there was this game killer idea that, like, this was someone in the cosmology of the Axe person, of the Axe consumer's world, who was basically the game killer, is a guy who ruins your dating life. And they thought this was such a clever idea that instead of playing with it in an ad, that it could actually be a show. And they created a show, and they sold that show to MTV. So if you TiVo past that, you TiVo past the entire program. So that's the kind of stuff on that side of the equation that's changed, that has, I think that this era will be looked back on as analogous to the creative revolution of the 60s, as a time when so many bounds were taken off the way that advertising had been done, and people will see it as just a time of massive creativity. Whether that's good for consumers is something we can talk about, but speaking of consumers, the other half of the equation is just as true that we see here with PBR, which I decided to put in the book because it was a pretty compelling example of embracing a brand. This new meaning of PBR as a kind of anti-brand brand was not cooked up at Pabst headquarters. It was cooked up by consumers. They completely projected that meaning onto the brand. And as we just learned, PBR had no idea what was going on or why they would do that. And that's a pretty compelling example of not of an idea being attached to a thing, and a pretty serious idea by consumers. And so my shorthand word, as was mentioned earlier, marketing, encompasses these things because, to me, what's happened, what's really changed, is that the lines that used to be very clear-cut between what's commercial persuasion and what's everyday life have in fact become extremely murky on both sides of the equation. So let me just round it off by talking quickly about that ethics thing that I mentioned in passing. What I refer to with consumer ethics is basically, it gets expressed now in ecological concerns. I was drinking this Poland Springs water, and it's the eco-shaped bottle. This is an example of an appeal to consumer ethics, because we're all very concerned about the earth now. So we'll have an eco-shaped bottle to address that. But, we are concerned about these things, and consumers in survey after survey will say, do you care about this environmental issue? Do you care about labor conditions? Would you pay more for a t-shirt that you knew was not made in a sweatshop? How much more would you pay? The 86%, I think, said they would pay $4 more for a $20, 20 to 24 for a t-shirt that they knew was not made in a sweatshop. So we know that those concerns are out there. We know that consumers do have these sort of ethical motivations in their minds. They want their decisions, they want their consumer decisions. They know that they're meaningful in the real world, and they want them to be the right decisions. But we also know that, I only give it the half factor, not because I don't think we believe in it, but we also know that they don't really behave that way. And the percentage of people who actually are, paying more for the t-shirt that they know. And that's not to blame consumer. In a lot of ways, that's just a function of the way the marketplace is set up. When you go into Target or something to buy a t-shirt, there's not a bin here that says $20 t-shirts possibly made in a sweatshop. And another bin that says $24 t-shirts absolutely not made in a sweatshop. And it's by design that a big part of the business of commercial persuasion is actually very specifically to prevent you from stopping and thinking about those issues. It's to have you make a shortcut decision based on some, what they call a heuristic in psychology, but just a mental shortcut. That's a lot of what branding is about, so that you'll, like I was mentioning the Dove thing, you'll just see it and say, like, I have kind of a good feeling about that, I've heard about that, I'll check it out. And that's realistic. You can't expect every consumer to do a spreadsheet on every single purchase that they make. But my point in writing the book is that I do believe strongly that we want to make these good decisions. And I also believe strongly that there's a lot of forces coming at us that are pushing us in a different direction, trying to get us to make decisions for other reasons. And the worst mindset, I believe, that a consumer can have going into that is, I'm brand proof, I'm above it all, and none of it affects me, So therefore, everything I'm doing must be based on the most rational decisions. So I hope that through the course of the book, I pull back the curtain a bit on both the way that the industry works and also the way that the human mind works, so that when you come out the other end, maybe you'll shop, consume a little bit differently and a little more consistently with what's really important to you. So I'll end it there and take any questions and continue the discussion, which I didn't mean to short circuit earlier, but yes?
I guess just thinking back to your story and kind of my thoughts on marketing and what I thought about since starting work here, I wonder if the shift isn't so much that people are brand proof, but just that it's changed to be interactive. So a lot of like the internet viral marketing that's just, oh, I sent my friend a video, so I'm making a choice to participate in this marketing thing, because I don't think anyone's so self-unaware that they don't think that sending the video of Elf yourself has nothing to do with Staples. So it's that you're making that choice. Okay, well, maybe not, never mind.
What, are we confused about what Elf yourself? I know what that is.
Office Max.
Office Max, sorry.
Oh.
I get all, it's a brand, you know, it's a brand, I guess, but it is, it's that, or when you're, anything that's like on the street or kind of the countercultural activity is a choice to participate in it. And so it's just, I guess the industry realizing that if people are participating, they don't feel like they're getting duped because it's their choice.
Yeah, well, let me just say, I'm not the one who said people
Well,
that's what everyone else is saying, that people think, you know, that there's, that the new consumer is super brand proof. And, you know, the interesting thing about campaigns like this, the one you're talking about where, I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it's for an office supply chain. And the idea was that because I got it from somebody, and so you get this email, and it's like a friend of mine and his kid dancing around as elves with their face superimposed on a thing, and then brought to you by whatever, and it's all, so it's Office Max? And that was really a popular promotion. The interesting thing about campaigns like that and about these viral things, or interactive, however you want to call it, is that they tap into something that's always been true, which is that we trust our friends. You know, I mean, that's like the who do you really take advice from? And well, we trust our friends more than we trust ads. And this is something else that's sort of talked about as this is a new development. We've always trusted our friends more than we trust ads. There's never been a time when someone was like, well, my next door neighbor bought this, and he says it's great, but I just saw an ad for the competitor, and I believe it because it came out on my television set. That never happened. What's different now is the degree to which, because of these technologies, it's possible to turn your friend into an advertising medium. So that instead of getting the email from the company, you get it from your friend. And, you know, that's positioned in some cases as like, well, it's participatory and it's sort of empowering, but it's really, I don't know how empowering that is. And I guess that we get some enjoyment out of those things. And I guess we also just saw a little mini case study there in how effective it is for the brand, because he uses that as a staple. But the upshot is that it's yet another example of how these technologies have been not really necessarily a totally bad thing for the marketing industry. And I think it's interesting that it's so acceptable to send your friend an ad, and that no one really seems to have a problem with it.
I don't think when you send it, you think you make the connection. Well, you don't say to yourself, I'm sending an ad.
Right.
I'm sending a funny card to my friend.
I think
has some benefit.
I'm certain that that's right. I think that how your friend reacts may vary. It may vary.
But I think most friends would also think, I'm getting a funny card that happens to have a brand associated with it, but my friend probably isn't endorsing the product either. I think most
And the upshot of it is that the brand name gets around, and that's it.
It's a bonus no matter what, in all my
I agree with that. Yes, sir.
What are some of, I guess, from the book or just your own, from what you've seen, what some good examples and some poor examples of branding that companies have done in terms of, like, you know, completely normal middle of the range product that somehow population scoops up and elevates, or the opposite, like a really high quality product that they do a terrible job of branding, and therefore it kind of just
Yeah. Well, I'll address the former one. An interesting one, I think, that I do talk about some in the book is Method soaps and home cleaning products, which I think is interesting on a couple of levels. They went into what was seen as a pretty mundane category, dish soap, which is not really strongly identified with your identity, things like that. And isn't really a good example of status, and a lot of the traditional, like you can't compare it to a fashion brand per se. And they had two things that they were doing differently. One was the formulation, which was eco-friendly, fewer synthetics, and then the design of the bottles and the packaging. They put a much in selling, they put a much higher emphasis in branding that thing. They put a much stronger emphasis on the design side. They brought in a very well-known industrial designer to do one bottle in particular that won design awards from ID and other places, and really elevated them in that sense. And when I talked to them, they said that their initial research indicated that people were responding to the visual appeal of the bottles. And frankly, people that they heard from kind of were thinking it wouldn't work that well, but it looked cool, and so they were going to give it a try, which is really interesting in and of itself. Why would you do that? But because it can't be explained by, I don't care how good your dish soap bottle looks, not that many people are going to see it. You're not going to be impressing the neighbors with that, keeping up with the Joneses. So I think, and this is part of what I say in the book, is that a lot of stuff that gets explained as conspicuous consumption really has nothing to do with impressing other people. It has to do with ourselves. It has to do with our personal narrative and like sort of self-signaling. And what I liked the most, though, about the Method story, and I think that they would put this almost the same way, is that they believed in the eco-friendly formulations as an important part of what they were doing. They didn't necessarily believe that it would get them the mass acceptance, the mass level acceptance that they wanted. And they wanted to go with this other kind of approach as their front message. And that doesn't mean that they ignored, the information is there for the consumer who really is tuned into those ethical issues. And they kind of gave the consumer a two ways in. And I think that's, I talk about in the book what I call as replacing the lowest common denominator, the murkiest common denominator, where I think that the way mass brands are getting built and are going to get built is not necessarily through here's the one central message that everyone gets. It's sort of here are these different messages that different consumers respond to or create, and it's sort of people come together in this murky thing, and they may not even all have the same idea of what the brand means. So Method is one of the ones that I think is interesting, and it's done quite well. It's not at the level of, they're not Procter & Gamble, but it's done extremely well, and without what you would call traditional marketing. Yes, sir.
Do the Pabst, do the folks at Pabst have any plans to, now we're 2 years later? Is that when we are 2 years later from the initial?
Yeah, a couple years, yeah.
A couple years later. So are they trying to figure out a way how to leverage this phenomenon and move beyond the scumbag liker market? And is that a big enough market to sustain that brand?
The company that owns that brand is the Pabst Brewing Company owns a bunch of these sort of dying laggard brands. Schlitz, Carling Black Label, Colt 45, a bunch of these things. I can't name them all, but I think that what they're doing is trying to, and I'm not in touch with them lately, but I know that like with Colt 45, they're in the midst of a push to try to revive that or increase sales of that. They've hired some artists to do this promotion where they're doing things on brown paper bags. Do you know about this? Or
I heard about it.
yeah, and it's to create buzz and connect with the kind of this another sort of hipster consumer. That seems to be more what I've seen evidence of them doing, is kind of trying to recreate the PBR phenomenon with other things in their portfolio. I don't know. They're not a big budget company. So I don't know that they're in a position to, and the meaning of PBR in the marketplace is pretty specific at this point, and I don't know how much further they can grow. I mean, I say that, and people have been predicting that it was going to tank any year now for however long this has been going on. So that's about as much as I know. But,
I was kind of curious if that even just spread within apps, if they get the biker scumbags all over America, or is it like just in the Pacific Northwest, or?
No, he was getting I mean, I think that's how it traveled out. Really, I think that the bike, from what I learned, that bike messenger thing in particular was important because they spread the word amongst each other that they would do these bike messengers do all kinds of crazy fun events, and they want to have some beer on hand or have some money for prizes or whatever. And once it became known in that world that PBR was writing some checks, the word kind of got around. And bike messengers have a weird role in hipster culture of they're just cooler than. I don't totally get it, but they've set some trends, and in the years since then, I mean, a number of other companies have made concerted efforts to sort of go after the bike messenger contingency on the theory that, well, they were helpful with PBR, they'll be able to help our brand, and of course that kind of thinking rarely works. Okay, you were going to ask.
What did the advertising age folks do in the 1940s when they met the new savvy consumer?
What did they do?
Yeah, you said there were all these magazine articles panicking about the.
They advised their readers that they would have to, treat this consumer with more respect, stop insulting their intelligence, listen to them, take them more seriously.
What were the results? Did they have, did they have marketing campaigns and bike messengers, or?
No, I think that, it fits in. That incident was just one moment in the history of advertising and consumers has been it's always evolving, it's always changing in terms of, and frankly, one of the recurring themes, I think, over time, is that advertising itself has become steadily less rationally based. If you look at old ads, they do make elaborate, long, magazine ads. Here's a long case of why you should have this product. And now what you're much more likely to see, and this happened over time, is just, a picture of a woman. And then the name of the brand at the bottom. I don't even know what that means, but it sort of gives you this emotional, oh, okay, or maybe you're supposed to ask somebody, but it's become less and less, people have said, we don't care what 4 out of 5 dentists say anymore, because that's been we just don't trust that anymore. So now instead, one of the examples actually in the book is Red Bull. The big sales pitch on Red Bull is what? It's with taurine. Well, what's taurine? I mean, they don't even say. And that worked to their benefit. That it became a lot of the response to Red Bull was much more kind of emotional and projection by the consumer into what taurine might be and how it might be helpful. I think it did wonders for them to take this almost information-free approach. Yes.
So I'm always interested in parallels to other things. I wonder if you find any parallels to politics or public sector announcements or even just public health campaigns. Any other time when you're trying to spread a message and you think that things have changed?
Mm-hmm. People, of course, ask about politics a lot because of the season that we're in. And specifically, people often ask about Obama. Do I think that he's is he a brand? Is he a marketing type? Is he a marketing style brand?
Or even ignoring him. But it would be interesting to hear what you have to say about him. But just in general, anytime when you're trying to convince other people and you're trying to draw a movement,
well,
I think that people are taking the same ideas.
There are lots of parallels between the two sectors, and it's no coincidence. A lot of the same people go back and forth on the industry side, like people in the advertising, and they learn from each other. Candidates are a little bit different from brands. I think in some ways parties are more like brands because they want your lifetime loyalty in a way that a specific candidate doesn't. And you know, you're definitely trying to attach an idea to a thing there in the sense of, well, what's the idea? Like my personal view would be like the Democratic idea would be, the Democratic Party's idea would be something like idealism or something like along those lines, tracing back Kennedy to, and the Republican Party's idea might be something like common sense. And it's one of the reasons the Republican brand is having some trouble right now, is because the last 8 years haven't felt like a time of common sense. It's undercutting the usual Republican message. So I think they're swimming upstream against that. And on a just pure tactical level, obviously they're using all of, you know, same thing with all these different, they're certainly embracing every media form that they can, and they have to. It's interesting to speculate on how that murkiest common denominator idea works with a political candidate, and does, I mean, in some ways politicians have always done this. They're just trying to bunch together a bunch of different constituencies who may all be coming to that candidate for kind of different and maybe even contradictory reasons. That may be even more true with this go-round than ever. We'll see.
What about something like the anti-smoking campaign or the war on drugs? Do you think any of this lessons could be used there for greater good, or have you seen?
Somehow, that's not an area that I've focused on a lot, but somehow it feels like those sort of public service things always just feel like lectures, and the tone is always sort of different. When there's an emotional appeal, it's more of a fear-based appeal. It's rarely a sort of, I mean, and the truth is that, you know, I was talking about these things like the eco-conscious ball or whatever. There's a lot of campaigns now kind of flooding the marketplace to just sort of, that they almost blur the line between, they sort of make it seem, I think that there's a big overpowering message out there right now, just in general, that if you're concerned about the environment, buy my product. And that's it's interesting to compare the tone of those with the more lectury and less sexy tone of public awareness about some, you know, thing that you should just, there's no sell there that makes you feel good about participating in that, whereas you can feel good about buying a certain kind of canvas bag and feel like you've helped save the earth by buying it. How are we doing on time here?
We have about 2 minutes.
Okay. Is there one more?
In the case of your book, did you talk to, looking at it from the consumer perspective, did you talk to behavioral scientists and people who analyze how people feel emotionally about brands and how they feel emotionally about purchase decisions? And to behavioral scientists, is there a majority that believe that people's overall attitude towards brands is changing, or towards the buying process is changing over time?
I don't know about the end. I did certainly talk to some of those people. I don't know about how they feel about that. I don't know that their work tends to be, I mean, you know, that takes someone like me to come in and make that kind of judgment, I think, because I'm more of a I'm focused on the culture, and those guys tend to be focused on a particular project. And, you know, the book does draw on more on their research than interviews with them, and particularly some of the behavioral economics research that I think is relevant to just basic consumer decisions. And, you know, you can't ignore those people if you're talking about this stuff, because a lot of them are doing, you know, a lot of work for corporations. One of the things that I wanted to do was say, well, it's interesting that corporations have taken the time to commission this research. You know, to the extent that you can get a hold of that research, I think it's interesting for consumers to be aware of it too. Because absolutely, they're focused on emotional appeals. I mean, the way one put it in the book is that, you know, we don't want reflection, we want action. And the way to get action is through emotional appeals. So. Anything else?